The sponsors of this event, Apademar, Morgan & Morgan, Pato Moreno y Abad, Tapia Linares y Alfaro, Anzola Rubio y Asociados, Capamec y la Asociación Bancaria de Panamá, had brought Dan Mitchell today for us to have a broadened view of the problem that we're facing with the tax competition issue and the pressures that the country is having because our tax system and our internal regulations. Dan is a top expert on tax reform and supply-side tax policy. He's a strong advocate of flat tax and international tax competition. Prior to joining the Cato Institute, Mitchell was a senior fellow with the Heritage Foundation and an economist for Senator Bob Packwood and the Senate Finance Committee. He also served on the 1988 Bush-Quayle transition team and was Director of Tax and Budget Policy for Citizens for a Sound Economy. Dan's articles can be found in such publications as the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Investor Business Daily, and the Washington Post. He's a frequent guest on radio and television and a popular speaker in the lecture circuit. Dan Mitchell holds a bachelor's and master's degrees in economics from the University of Georgia and a PhD in economics from George Mason University. With nothing else, I would like Dan to come.
Thank you, Carlos. I'm very happy to be back in Panama. I first came down here, I think, in 2000 or 2001, and it's good to see many old friends like Carlos and Ramon and others here. I have a PowerPoint presentation, a lot of slides. I apologize for talking English, but as an American, we're just not very good with foreign languages. They say someone who speaks 2 languages is bilingual, someone who speaks 3 languages is trilingual, someone who speaks 1 language is from the United States. And I'm definitely in that category. Fortunately, my lovely girlfriend speaks about 4 or 5 languages, so she comes as my translator on these events. But let's go ahead and go right into the presentation. A lot of slides. I'll try not to talk too fast because I'm from New York. But the slides, I think, will make it easy to follow, and then hopefully we'll have time for some Q&A at the end. First, since I'm an economist, we're going to go through a little economics lesson about what is tax competition, what the underlying issues are with tax competition, to help explain why some of the high-tax countries are being so difficult about this issue. But tax competition, it's sort of like competition between banks or competition between grocery stores or gas stations. It simply exists when you don't have control to set your own prices, or in the case of governments, when you feel that you can't set tax rates as high as you want to, because then economic activity, jobs and investment might go to countries with lower tax rates. Now, if you're the owner of an only gas station in a town, you don't like there to be competition, because if you're the owner of the only station, you can charge high prices, you're in charge. But if there are 5 gas stations in town and you have to compete with the other gas stations, you don't like it. And likewise, governments don't like when they have to compete with other governments. And what's really made tax competition important over the last 10, 20, 30 years is globalization. And I want to show you a chart that underscores why globalization has made a difference. This is data just from the United States. It starts, the numbers are too small, but it basically starts back in, I think, 1975 or 1976, and it simply shows passive investment or indirect investment in the American economy. In other words, this is a measure of foreigners who are investing money in the U.S. economy. And you can see that all through the 1970s, into the early 1980s, it was a very small amount of money that was coming into America to buy things like stocks and bonds. But as we got into the 1990s and then beyond, you can see that this amount of money has skyrocketed, and we now have about $13 trillion of indirect investment from what are technically known as non-resident aliens. If you're a Panamanian citizen and you have any investment in the United States in stocks and bonds, that's reflected in this chart. Now, this is just the United States, But if we had good global data, we would see a similar big increase in cross-border investment. This cross-border investment is very good for the global economy. It's very good for individual investors, but high-tax governments don't like it. They don't like it because obviously the money tends to go from high-tax countries to low-tax countries. Now, I'll talk a little bit later. One of the reasons why the United States has so much of this money is because we're a tax haven ourselves, not for American citizens. I can't benefit from these policies, but for non-resident aliens, we have some very attractive laws. But anyhow, we see this big increase in cross-border investment. What do we also know? Well, we know that tax rates have fallen. If you go back to, say, 1980, and you look at tax rates for the industrialized world, you'll see that the top tax rate used to be over 67%. Now it's down to 42%. That's still far too high, but it's come down to 42% because governments have been forced to compete with each other. When Reagan and Thatcher started cutting tax rates back around 1979, 1981, all sorts of other countries had to do the same thing. The same things happened with the corporate tax rate. The corporate tax rate in OECD nations used to average 48%. Now it's down to 24%. In the European Union, it's down to almost 21%, which is really amazing. Those are the high-tax governments. You would think they would have very high tax rates. But because they're a common market, it's really accentuated the competition between them, and so corporate tax rates have dropped a lot. Now, I don't think it's a coincidence. As foreign investment, cross-border investment has gone up, tax rates have come down. And I think those two things are very, very closely related. But you don't have to believe me. The OECD will say the same thing. They look at that and they complain. They say, oh, isn't this bad? We have more cross-border investment, and that means people are able to escape bad tax systems. They think this is a bad thing. I think it's a good thing. But it's not just the individual income tax rate. This is the corporate tax rate. This is for OECD nations. That's in blue. The U.S. is in red. And you can see that the United States has fallen behind. We now have, I'm embarrassed to say, we now have the highest corporate tax rate in the entire world, not just in the OECD, the entire world. There's not a single country that has a higher corporate tax rate than the United States. So you probably don't want to do direct investment into the U.S., but it is a good idea to do indirect investment into the U.S. Now, the tax competition premise, of course, is that, as I said, these increases in cross-border economic activity are directly connected to the lowering of tax rates, and this is causing countries to compete with each other. Even France and Germany have lowered tax rates, not because they want to. Even the so-called right-wing parties in France and Germany are very statist in their orientation. They never like to lower corporate tax rates. They never like to lower personal tax rates, but they've done it not because they want to, but because they felt they had no choice because of competition among countries. I want to reemphasize, globalization has changed the rules, and changed the rules in a very good way. In other words, globalization isn't just about goods and services. It's not just about trade and goods. It's also about the ability to invest money on a global basis, diversify assets, and get increased economic growth as a result. Now, it's not just the headline tax rates on individual and corporate income. We've also seen reductions in the double taxation of dividends and capital gains. We've seen countries reduce or eliminate death taxes and wealth taxes. The number of flat tax jurisdictions, when I first started in Washington, there were only 3 flat tax jurisdictions in the world. Now there are more than 30. You know, sort of funny, when I do my salary review at the Cato Institute, I always say, look at this. This is a sign that I'm effective. But in reality, it's nothing to do with me. It's all because of tax competition between countries. I just try to take credit for it. Now, when we think about the economics of this issue, you sort of have 2 different sides. On one side, you have the economists and taxpayers who like tax competition because it's a liberalizing force in the world economy. And think about it this way. Think about, well, most of you are too young, but if you've read your economic history, you know that the 1970s were a very bad decade for the global economy. Lots of economic stagnation, rising prices, high unemployment, but a lot of that bad news went away once countries started liberalizing their economies and cutting tax rates. So that's why economists like tax competition, because tax competition puts pressure on governments to do good policy, even though politicians oftentimes don't want to do good policy. So the economists and the taxpayers like tax competition, but unfortunately, we do have politicians from high-tax governments and from the international bureaucracies that are controlled by high-tax governments. They don't like tax competition. They're the ones that are pushing for all these international, I don't want to say agreements, because that implies that anybody would want to agree with them. They're the ones coordinating all the international pressure to force jurisdictions such as Panama to change your laws in ways that are not good for your economy. And why are they doing that? Because they want to make it easier for France and Germany and other countries to go back to the kinds of high tax rates that they had in the 1970s. So who's right? We have this fight between people who like tax competition and people who don't like it. Well, it depends on what you want. Your answer to this question, is tax competition good? Do you want lower tax rates and more efficient government? Or do you want higher tax rates and more government spending? Do you want more growth? Or do you think it's important to have more redistribution? I obviously come down on the side of it's better to have lower tax rates and more economic growth. But if you had President Hollande from France up here, he would tell you that the moral imperative is to have high tax rates and more redistribution. I think he's wrong, because I think in the long run, not just the long run, even in the short run, those policies are bad for poor people. And the politicians who like high tax rates say, oh, we need these high tax rates so we can redistribute more money and help the poor. Well, how does it help the poor to have no growth? If you're in France or Italy and your economy is not growing at all, your poor people have no chance to climb the ladder of economic opportunity. Where if you're in a very low tax jurisdiction, then there's growth and poor people have a chance to have what's called upward mobility. So I think that the people on the left are wrong on this issue, but they see the economy, I think, they make a big mistake. They think the economy is a fixed pie, and they think it doesn't grow. Now that's just wrong, but I think it's a mental block that they have. So let's elaborate on these issues. And I want to explain now why the high-tax governments are so misguided on this issue. They're misguided on this issue because they have a giant fiscal crisis that they have created. And it's not just that their governments are very big now, but their governments are going to get much, much bigger in the future. Let me show you a couple of charts. This is a chart from the OECD. The OECD, of course, has their anti-tax competition project, which I don't like at all, and we'll talk about that. But they also collect statistics. They do a pretty good job at that. So I like one small part of the OECD, and of course I dislike the rest, but the statistics that they collect are interesting. And this is an estimate that the OECD put together of the amount of long-term fiscal challenges for different major countries. And it's a measure of how much annual fiscal consolidation has to take place to stabilize debt at 60% of GDP by the year 2030. Now, all you need to understand is that you don't want your bar to be high on this chart, and yet you can see countries like Greece, Japan, Portugal, the US, Spain, Ireland, Great Britain. You see these countries where in order to stabilize their fiscal policy, they would have to have fiscal consolidation of greater than 6% of GDP every single year between now and 2030, simply to keep their debt problem from getting worse. In other words, they're in trouble now, and because of demographics, aging populations, and because of all these promises that they've made to spend money, as bad as they are now, it's going to get worse in the future. And in order to stop it from getting worse, they have to either reduce the growth of government spending, which of course they don't want to do, or they need to figure out how to get a giant pile of new tax revenue. And this is why they're looking at countries like Panama. They think there's a giant pile of tax revenue here. They think that there's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. I don't know if you have that story of leprechauns that we have in the US, but they think there's a big pot of money here in Panama, and if they can just force you to change your laws so that your deputy tax collectors for the French government, the English government, the US government, they think they can somehow deal with this long-run problem. This is a chart from the OECD. Here's a similar chart. Well, it's not similar. It looks a lot different, but it's from the IMF. And what we see in this chart is that the increase in future spending is on the vertical axis, and the increase in the amount of fiscal consolidation needed is on the horizontal axis. So in other words, the horizontal axis is like that previous chart we saw, the amount of fiscal consolidation needed, and of course the amount of fiscal consolidation you need is connected to the fact that your spending is going up. Now, one thing, I already said I was ashamed that the U.S. had the highest corporate tax rate in the world. Well, here's another bad thing about the United States. If it's bad to be on the vertical axis high, and if it's bad to be on the horizontal axis out, you don't want to be in the upper right quadrant. And yet, what country do we see farthest in the upper right quadrant? The United States. And so this is one of the reasons why the United States, sometimes we have politicians who want to get in bed with the French and the Germans and the Japanese and push some of these anti-tax competition projects. So what I'm really saying is that even though the United States is sometimes considered to be an example of Anglo-Saxon free market capitalism, no. We have big long-term fiscal problems for the same reason that France and Italy and Germany and Japan have long-run fiscal problems. Our population is aging, there are fewer and fewer children, and politicians have made promises to spend a lot of money. So you better believe that we have a lot of the people in Washington, like Senator Levin and President Obama, who anxiously want to go around the world and force other countries to enforce our bad tax laws. Now, let me go ahead and do a detour here and talk about what is good tax policy, because sometimes if people don't understand this, they don't realize why it's so important to resist what the OECD is trying to do. Well, good tax policy is to have low tax rates, not high tax rates. Good tax policy is not to double tax saving and investing. Every single economic theory, even Marxism, even socialism, every single economic theory says you get more growth by setting aside some of today's income to finance tomorrow's growth. In other words, you have to have capital formation to have future economic growth. And yet, a lot of countries have very high and punitive tax rates on dividends, capital gains, death taxes. In the United States, for instance, between the capital gains tax, the corporate income tax, the double tax on dividends, and the death tax, a single dollar of income can be taxed 4 different times. But it only gets taxed 4 different times if you save and invest. If you consume your money right away, the government leaves you alone. So the message is, don't accumulate capital, don't save and invest, spend right away. Well, that's economically very foolish. And so if you want good tax policy, you want to make sure you tax economic activity only one time. You also don't want any loopholes, and you also want territorial taxation. Why do you want territorial taxation? It's simply good fences make good neighbors. If something happens in the U.S. can decide how and when to tax it. If something happens in Panama, the Panamanians should decide how and when to tax it. I live in Virginia in the United States. If I go to Nevada, if I go out to Las Vegas to a conference, if I want to go play blackjack, should Virginia get to arrest me because I gambled in Nevada? No. That would be a violation of Nevada's sovereignty, and it would be Virginia trying to have extraterritorial sovereignty. But what is this whole OECD agenda all about? It's about them trying to impose their bad tax laws on an extraterritorial basis, which is what no country should be allowed to do. Now, let's compare good policy to what the OECD wants. Good policy through tax competition means lower tax rates. The OECD, on the other hand, their whole agenda, you can read their documents, and they explicitly say we need to undermine and stop tax competition to enable so-called progressive tax rates, although there's nothing progressive about punishing economic growth, so I don't like using that word progressive. Tax competition means less double taxation. What's the OECD trying to do? It's all designed largely to increase double taxation of people's assets, of their saving and investing. They want to make it possible for high-tax governments to track dividends and capital gains around the world and subject them to double taxation. Tax competition, of course, means territorial taxation. The OECD agenda is based on worldwide taxation. So everything that public finance economists understand about good tax policy, that's the opposite of what the OECD is trying to do. They are like the dinosaurs of fiscal policy. They should go extinct, but unfortunately, when you get a bunch of big dinosaurs together and they want to try to trample the sovereignty of smaller jurisdictions, then it becomes a major challenge. Now let's talk about what's the theory that the OECD has, because they do have their own theory. It's called capital export neutrality. And the basic premise of this theory is that taxpayers should never be able to lower their tax rates by moving economic activity across a border. And according to this theory, and this is very important to understand when we're going to start talking about the moving goalpost in a little bit, it's very important that this theory says that tax evasion and tax avoidance are equally bad. Legal tax planning is bad according to the OECD. Why? Well, let's explain what the capital export neutrality says. The capital export neutrality, if you had like a tax professor up here and he was doing a theory course, he would say that capital export neutrality, you assume a world with no taxes. I actually like that part of the theory, so I'm with them so far. So you assume a world with no taxes, and what do we know about that world with no taxes? We know that taxpayers are going to allocate their economic activity on the basis of pre-tax rates of return. Why? Because the pre-tax rate of return and the post-tax rate of return are the same thing, because there's no taxes. In other words, in a world with no taxes, people do things on the basis solely of economic efficiency. And if you assume people are doing things on the basis of economic efficiency, then you maximize your economic output. So that's the hypothetical world with no taxes. But then you say, okay, let's start drawing borders in this hypothetical world. And in all these different borders, in these different countries that we're creating, we're going to have different tax systems. What's going to happen? Well, compared to the hypothetical world, people are obviously going to change their investment. Because in one hypothetical country we'll call France, taxes will be very high. In another hypothetical country like Hong Kong, taxes will be very low. So as we introduce this element of the real world to this hypothetical model, people are going to change their economic activity. They're looking, in other words, at post-tax rates of return to determine how they're investing and allocating their money. Now, what the advocates of capital export neutrality then say is they say, well, this is bad. It's bad because in the hypothetical world with no taxes, all resources were allocated on the basis of efficiency. Now, in this more realistic world with borders in different countries, people are changing their allocation of resources, and by definition, it's not going to be as efficient. And so therefore they say, aha, let's therefore harmonize all taxes. Let's make sure all taxes are equal. And in theory, they have a point. But now let's look at reality. Now this is just more a description of CEN. They want to make sure pre-tax rates of return are all the same. And this is what the OECD and the European Commission all think about. But let's look at why it's wrong. It's wrong because in the real world, tax rates are not exogenous. You know, the CEN theory assumes that tax rates sort of float down from heaven. But of course, we know from looking at the history of tax competition that countries will set their tax rates based on what their competitors are doing. And obviously, if you move into a world where you're not allowed to have tax competition, what's going to happen? Countries are going to push their tax rates up to where they were in the 1970s. So that's one way the capital export neutrality theory is flawed. Also, the capital export neutrality theory assumes the economy is fixed in size. It doesn't grow or shrink. Well, of course, we know from looking at history also that when some countries have high tax rates, they grow slower. If other countries have low tax rates, they grow faster. So in the real world, we know that the economic pie isn't fixed. We know that the economy is determined to some degree on what different countries have in terms of tax policy. And another big flaw of capital export neutrality, it overlooks what economists call the public choice school of analysis. And public choice economics is simply the application of incentives to the political class. And if you start looking at it that way, you understand politicians want what? They want more power, they want more money, and so you can understand why politicians get together through the OECD to push for high tax rates. They don't like tax competition. So the theory of capital export neutrality is wrong. Now, why am I bothering to talk about this theory? The reason I'm talking about it is I want people to understand that what the OECD is doing is wrong based on what is good economics, what is good for global growth. The OECD says they exist to promote global growth. And on some issues like trade, the OECD actually has some decent ideas. But on public finance issues, as I said before, the OECD and the high tax nations it represents are dinosaurs. They're living in the past, they're pushing bad theory, they're pushing bad economics, they're contradicted. Everything that they're trying to do is contradicted by the latest academic research. They are wrong, you are right. That's all I'm really trying to say. So now let's go into the part of the presentation that people here are probably most interested in. What's the status of the fight? Well, unfortunately, for the last couple of years, we've been losing. The OECD, as you may remember, first came out with their so-called harmful tax competition project back in 1998. Then they, of course, had the blacklist in 2000. Panama was one of the, I think it was 41 jurisdictions that were on the blacklist. Of course, it was a very hypocritical blacklist because no OECD nation was on it, not Luxembourg, not Switzerland, not the United States, not the United Kingdom. But they had the blacklist. But then the good news is we managed to stall the OECD. The Bush administration may have had a very big government orientation, but we were able to pressure them in Washington not to be supportive of the OECD agenda. And just like you can't have OPEC without Saudi Arabia, you can't really have a global tax cartel without the United States. And so by pressuring the Bush administration not to be supportive of the OECD agenda, we were able to basically stop the OECD from making much progress between 2000 and 2008. But then Obama got elected. And Obama, ideologically, he's Francois Hollande. That is his mindset. He really, I think, would be more comfortable being a European. We volunteered to send him there, but he doesn't seem to want to go. But ever since Obama got elected, and especially with the global financial crisis, you had all these politicians getting together, except that they sort of stopped really working through the OECD as much as they started then working through the G20. But it doesn't really matter because it's all the same governments ultimately that are behind it. So the US, the UK, Germany, France, Japan, they all got together. They used the global financial crisis. They used the fact that the US was now back on the wrong side of issues to say, okay, if countries don't go along with us, we're going to blacklist them, we're going to subject them to financial protectionism, we're going to do all sorts of bad things to them. And so now even Switzerland has been forced to say that their human rights laws on financial privacy no longer protect foreign investors. So you have this whole OECD process where in theory everyone has to agree to enforce the bad tax laws of other nations. You have a minimum number of tax information exchange agreements that you're supposed to sign. You have a so-called peer review process, but of course it's dominated by the high tax countries. So there's no peer in the review. It's all just them giving orders, and then countries like Panama are supposed to salute and say, yes, sir. Where do we jump off the plank and hurt our own economies? But it goes beyond that. Remember I said that tax evasion and tax avoidance are equally bad according to the OECD? Well, this is exactly what politicians want to hear because they want to get more money. Why? Those charts we showed earlier. As bad as their economies are today, their economies are going to be even worse in the future because they have fewer and fewer people producing and more people living off government. And when that ratio gets bad, that's when you pretty much lose hope. Once you have a majority of your people in your economy, a majority of your voters living off government, there's almost no hope of reform. And that's where a lot of OECD nations are heading, and that's why they want to go after not just tax evasion, they also want to go after tax avoidance. Some of you may have heard of the Multilateral Convention on Mutual Administrative Assistance in Tax Matters. This is sort of the genesis of an international tax organization. But it's an international tax organization with the OECD in control. They'll be the judge, jury, and executioner in this new system. And we see it in the form of more and more demands. Demands for more tax information exchange agreements. And it's not just from the OECD, that's the multilateral effort. You have unilateral efforts such as the FATCA out of the United States. You have the bilateral initiatives. In other words, the goalposts are never going to stop moving. Anytime you think, oh, well, if we just agree to this demand from the OECD, or if we just agree to this demand from the United States, everything will be okay. No, it won't be. All that's going to happen is they're going to digest that demand and then come back and ask for even more. In other words, breaking down financial privacy and imposing the tax information exchange agreements, that's just the start. They're going to go for more. So information exchange, I remember for years, whenever I would debate OECD officials, they would say, oh, no, you're being very unfair. We only want information exchange upon request. Matter of fact, I had Jeffrey Owens tell me, oh, you should support what we're doing because it's the European Commission. They want automatic information sharing. And I said, Jeffrey, you don't really expect me to believe that. He said, oh, of course he does this Scottish accent or Welsh accent. I can't imitate it, but he said, oh, no, Don, you don't have to worry about that. We only want on request. Well, the moment they had the chance, what did they do? They moved the goalposts. And they said, now we want automatic information sharing. But it's not, the automatic information sharing mostly is focused on individual capital income, But keep in mind, it's going to go everywhere. On labor income, as you have this destruction of financial privacy, and as you have this sort of global network of information sharing, what's going to happen? Other countries are going to copy the United States and do worldwide taxation. I mean, right now, the United States is the only industrialized nation to have worldwide taxation on labor income. Why do other countries not have it? Not because they don't want it, but because they've always assumed they had no way of enforcing it. Well, once you have governments knowing everything about everybody and tracking them around the world, it's just a matter of time before other countries impose the worldwide taxation. We're also seeing on corporate income, the OECD now has a BEPS initiative, base erosion and profit shifting. What's that designed to do? The whole purpose of the BEPS initiative is to do for corporate income what the OECD initiative is doing for individual capital income, trying to make it difficult for companies to earn income and declare income in low tax jurisdictions. Ultimately, at the end of the day, what the BEPS initiative is going to do is going to say to a company, oh, you say that you're declaring this much income in Ireland or Panama or Switzerland. In reality, we're going to say on the basis of a sales formula, that's really German income or US income or French income. And in other words, it would eviscerate tax competition on the corporate side. So just as the OECD initiative on capital income will push individual income tax rates back up, the OECD BEPS initiative will push corporate tax rates back up, ultimately by going to formula apportionment. Now, what about FATCA? I'm sort of ashamed to be an American to bring up FATCA because it really is an odious form of financial imperialism. Actually, it's financial protectionism because it's a 30% tax imposed on any financial flow if you don't agree to become a deputy tax collector for the US. That's bad. But what's worse is that the OECD and high-tax nations see FATCA as a global model. But there is a tiny sliver of good news. The tiny sliver of good news is that this creates a level playing field argument. We were able to use the level playing field argument last decade to help stop the OECD because of the gross hypocrisy of the OECD trying to blacklist smaller countries like Panama without blacklisting their own members like Switzerland, Luxembourg, and the US, not to mention Hong Kong and Singapore, which were too big to put on the original blacklist. Well, what about the level playing field issue today? Well, as I said before, the United States is the world's biggest tax haven, not on a de jure basis, on a de facto basis. Why? Well, some of you probably already know about things like Delaware companies, but I want to focus just on federal law. Under federal tax law, the United States generally does not tax interest and capital gains paid to non-resident aliens. And because we don't tax that income, the IRS doesn't collect it. And because the IRS doesn't collect it, guess what? There's no ability for the United States to engage in reciprocity. And FATCA, of course, allegedly is based on the notion that, okay, you give me all your information, we'll give you all our information, but we don't have the information. And so what does that mean? Well, in some sense, it means nothing because the US will say, too bad, we're the 800-pound gorilla of the world economy, so we'll tell you what to do, and you just have to accept it. But by the way, it's not just that we're hypocritical on FATCA, we also haven't ratified that Convention on Mutual Administrative Assistance in Tax Matters. Let me show you a couple of slides. This is from the Obama administration's legislative request from the Treasury Department. Now, you don't need to read everything. All you need to understand is that they are asking for the authority to collect the information necessary to engage in reciprocity under FATCA. So they admit, the Obama administration, by proposing this, admits that they aren't collecting and not sharing the information that would be necessary under FATCA to have a level playing field. But it's not just that. Here's from the OECD website. You know, they have a list of all the countries that have signed on to this convention. The Obama administration signed it, but guess what? It hasn't entered into force. Why not? Because it hasn't been ratified. You can't do a treaty without the Senate ratifying it. So here's all you need to understand about that convention. Here's all you need to understand about FATCA. The House of Representatives, controlled by Republicans, is not going to pass that legislation that the Obama administration wants. Matter of fact, the Republican National Committee just endorsed repeal of FATCA. And Senator Rand Paul has legislation to repeal FATCA. So there are a lot of Americans who realize this is a very bad piece of legislation. Usually they understand that it's bad not because it's hurting, Panama or trying to impose U.S. will on the rest of the world. For the most part, the reason that Americans are getting upset is because there are about 7 million American expats around the world, and they hate FATCA. because FATCA has made it very difficult and very expensive for them to have financial services where they're living. Now, the House isn't going to approve FATCA. Guess what? Or the Senate isn't going to ratify that OECD convention. And when we get to the 2014 elections, where Republicans are going to increase their strength in the House and probably take control of the Senate, obviously all these things the Obama administration wants aren't going to happen. They're going to become even less likely. So in other words, we have a playing field right now that isn't level. And guess what? After the 2014 elections, there's going to be zero chance that that playing field is going to be level. So I think one of the suggestions I have coming out of this meeting is that jurisdictions such as Panama should make this an issue in the same way that the level playing field was an issue last decade. Now, let's step back and look at the bigger picture. It is very, very difficult to resist powerful G7 or G20 nations. It's very difficult for a small country like Panama to tell the OECD or the European Commission to go jump in a lake. And how do you, it's not just the OECD, the UN, FATF, et cetera, you have all these international bureaucracies and bigger nations trying to impose pressure on you. Use the level playing field argument, try to expose the whole thing as being hypocritical, but at the end of the day, how can you fight? Well, what I would pose to you is that you don't really have a choice. You don't really have a choice because if you appease your enemies, if you feed an alligator your arm, does that turn him into a vegetarian? No. All that happens is tomorrow he's going to want to eat another arm and he's going to bring a friend with him. So as difficult as it is for Panama to resist some of these initiatives, I think at the end of the day you don't really have a choice. Because if you don't resist, if you don't fight against these things, other countries are simply going to increase their demands, move the goalposts over and over again. They're going to push for worldwide taxation. They're going to push for taxing corporate activity that occurs in Panama. They're going to want to tax labor activity that occurs in Panama. And of course, they're going to want to tax the capital income that is earned and managed in Panama. In other words, you have no choice. Otherwise, you wind up just becoming a fiscal colony for very uncompetitive nations. Now, let me go ahead and close up by pointing out, I've already sort of pointed out the theoretical reasons why the other side is so wrong. Let me just have it, I think this is actually an amusing anecdote. Back in during the 2008 elections, Obama pointed out Ugland House in the Cayman Islands. And he said that there were 12,000 companies registered at Ugland House. He said that made it, quote, either the biggest building in the world or the biggest tax scam in the world. I wish he had talked to Joe Biden. That's actually a sentence very few people ever say. Who wants to talk to Joe Biden? But the reason I think it would have been good for him to talk to Joe Biden is because Joe Biden used to be, his vice president, used to be a senator from Delaware. And if he had talked to Joe Biden, even though Joe Biden had never spent a day in the private sector in his life, I bet Joe Biden, just by being a senator from Delaware, would have understood that where a company is domiciled for legal purposes has nothing to do with where it operates, where its headquarters is. And as a matter of fact, here's a picture of another building. Now, Obama complained about Ugland House because he said there were 12,000 companies registered there. There were actually 18,000, but he was within 50% of the truth, which is good for a politician. Well, Ugland House is what, 4 to 5 stories tall? Here's a picture of a building in Delaware. This is a building that looks like it's 2 stories tall. I don't know, maybe there are 100 stories underground, you never know, but I think it's probably only 2 stories tall. This building in Delaware has how many companies? Take a guess. Anybody want to take a guess? Whoever gets the answer right, Carlos will buy you an expensive dinner. Anybody want to guess? Well, you're safe, Carlos, because probably nobody in their right mind would think that there are actually 221,000 companies domiciled at this one address in Delaware. This is, of course, part of the U.S. being a tax haven. You set up an LLC in Delaware, you don't have to collect any beneficial information. As long as there's no U.S. trade or business, it's completely protected in terms of privacy. But the point is that if Obama wants to complain about Ugland House for the 12,000, really 18,000 companies, then why isn't he complaining about that one building in Delaware? And by the way, there are several buildings in Delaware that have hundreds of thousands of companies domiciled there. Now, I suppose one final comment I should make. What about tax enforcement? isn't it important for people to obey the law? Isn't that a good thing? Well, I definitely believe in the rule of law. But I believe in the rule of law constrained by national borders. And so when you look at governments and tax policy, yes, I think governments have the right to impose bad tax policy. The real question is, do they have the right to impose that bad tax policy on an extraterritorial basis? Because that's what these initiatives are all about. I gave the analogy earlier about whether Virginia should be able to arrest me because I gamble in Nevada. I don't think they should. But let me give you a more real-world example. Would the United States, let's say that Saudi Arabia came to our Justice Department in Washington and said, oh, we see evidence that there's a Saudi woman driving in the United States. It's against the law for a woman to drive in Saudi Arabia. We want you to send her back to Saudi Arabia so we can punish her. Would the United States comply with that request? No. Tiananmen Square protesters escaped China. Some of them escaped. Some of them were killed, but some of them escaped, and some of them came to the United States. If the Chinese government came to the United States and said, we want you to extradite those Tiananmen Square protesters back to China so we can execute them, would the U.S. comply? It hasn't so far, and I hope it never will, because it's not against the law to believe in free speech in America. So we wouldn't ever help a government trying to impose that kind of bad law. Iran executes people for being gay. The United States, thankfully, would never help Iran enforce those laws if somebody who was gay escaped to America. In other words, countries all the time. Well, here's another real-world example. The European Union will not extradite someone back to the United States if they face the death penalty. So countries all the time choose what laws of each other's to enforce. Well, the same thing should exist in tax policy. There's nothing that says, at least in my mind, why it is moral or legally sound to have extraterritorial tax enforcement. And so with that, let me go ahead and shut up. I don't know how long I've gone on, but we can do some Q&A until everyone gets tired. Thank you very much. Now, I think the rules are, Carlos told me, just raise your hand and I'll call on you. Well, we're going to do it very simply. Yes, sir.
Yes. How are you? I see you again.
We do have a microphone, by the way, back there.
I see you again after a long time. What's going to happen after Obama? I mean, I think if I understood part of your speech, I agree with you that this initiative of the OECD has been strengthened by Obama's willingness to go that way. My question is, what do you think is going to happen after Obama becomes president? Do you think another Democratic government will be like that? I know the Republicans has another way of seeing things, but I don't know. That's politically speaking, because I don't see this is going to change unless Obama is get out of the presidency.
That's really the key issue. As I mentioned in my presentation, I think the 2014 elections will be meaningful in the sense that there's no hope for Obama to ratify that OECD convention or to pass the legal changes to have reciprocity under FATCA. Because, of course, FATCA, as it was passed, was unworkable, so the IRS just unilaterally changed it to have these intergovernmental agreements. Well, the intergovernmental agreements are based on reciprocity, but the U.S. can't do it. So I was basically making the advice, or offering the advice to Panama that you should hold on to the level playing field issue as a way of at least stalling and saying, okay, well, we're not going to do these things unless you do these things. But in the long run, and 2016, I guess, is the long run of this answer, what happens if Obama's gone? Well, it depends. If Hillary Clinton's the president, nothing changes. Congress will probably still be Republican, and so they won't pass some of these changes, but we won't really change anything from what we have right now. The real question is, what happens if you get someone like Rand Paul or Marco Rubio or Scott Walker, some Republican wins the White House? Well, then I actually have some degree of hope. I don't want to be overly optimistic, because as long as we have a very bad worldwide tax system, even a free market-oriented president will feel some compunction to try to enforce it. But if you get in a good free market-oriented Republican, then I think they'll be much less likely to do the multilateral stuff like the OECD, And I think you have a much greater chance of, say, repealing FATCA, or at least modifying it so you have safe harbor rules where FATCA doesn't apply if there's a TIA or something like that. But if you get a Republican in, then I think the whole game opens up again and at least gives us some hope to try to neutralize the OECD.
Carlos Troch from the Panamanian Banking Association. Dan, thank you very much for your speech. It was not clear to me about the consequences of FATCA legislation not passing through the Congress or the Senate. Let's suppose that happens. Will they be still able to enforce it with the other countries? I mean, are we going to have FATCA even if it doesn't pass the approval of the Congress?
Yeah. Well, I guess to elaborate, FATCA already is the law, but it's a law that was passed on the assumption that there would be reciprocity, and obviously that reciprocity doesn't exist, and it will not exist. But you have to ask yourself, does that matter? Because as I said, the U.S. is the big bully of the world economy, and if the United States leans on Panama and says, well, we don't have any information to give you, but too bad, we still want information from you. It's sort of like, if you're in the 3rd grade and the big 8th grader comes to you on the playground and says, give me your lunch money. Well, maybe you have to give them your lunch money. You might not have any choice. So the mere fact that the U.S. isn't going to pass legislation that would enable it to reciprocate doesn't mean that FATCA goes away. It's still there, and there's still pressure, and it becomes very, very difficult. I mean, if you're a fund manager or a bank or any type of institution here in Panama, it's very difficult to conduct business without having some nexus with the United States. And if the United States wants to punish you, the United States does have a lot of power to do that. It shouldn't. I think it shouldn't. I imagine you think it shouldn't. But what we think, frankly, doesn't matter. If some bureaucrat in the Treasury Department thinks it should, at the end of the day, that's what really matters. So what I'm really saying is that it's good to fight, it's good to resist, but you have to be strategic in your resisting. In some sense, stalling is probably the most effective strategy in the short run, and then, depending on what happens in the 2014 and 2016 elections, that may change what is possible.
Do you think that the big countries, like within the OECD, France, the British, all those who will be on a different level playing field, will pressure the United States so that Putin will follow, the United States will have to comply?
Well, I think the analogy is probably what we had last decade. Last decade, the European governments, at least the big ones, were bad on the OECD issues from start to finish. Even when Cameron took over in the UK, he was no different than Gordon Brown and Tony Blair. Hollande, Sarkozy, they're twins. I mean, one's from one party, one's from the other, but they're both statists. So I don't think anything will ever change in Europe, because as bad as the long-run fiscal challenges are in the U.S., they're at the crisis level in Europe. Matter of fact, I wouldn't be surprised if the European Central Bank only has limited ability to prop up these European fiscal systems. So I think it's just a matter of time before you have another fiscal crisis, not only in Southern Europe, but I think it spreads to France and Belgium next, because their economies are in very, very precarious shape. And so the Europeans, because there's no hope for them to reform, I think they're always going to want the OECD initiative to succeed. But guess what? If the U.S. pulls away from it, Panama can say no to France. Hong Kong can say no to France. Switzerland, even though it's right next door, can say no to France. It's hard to say no, though, when it's France, Japan, Germany, and the United States all together. And so I think really what happens in the United States has a very important long-run impact on this whole fight.
Yes, Enrique de Alba from Morgan & Morgan. Actually, my specialty is shipping and some corporate work. What I see going on here is Panama should make this a state issue. In other words, should get the finance tax experts to defend Panama's legislation, because Panama do have legislation that carry the obligation of the KYC policy, know your client, by law, and should try to enforce what our legislations provide for. I think Panama is not doing that. That's a way of stalling in a way. We even if needed, because the odds of not getting Hillary Clinton in the U.S. presidency are not so high. I believe probably that the U.S. will be having the first lady president in their history. Panama should take this to a higher level, to bring in the international institutions, organizations, such like a UN, or I don't know, the Organization of American States, and show the world that Panama is not a tax haven. Panama imposes high taxes on earnings produced within the Panama territory, and Panama has no business in becoming the policeman of the world, neither can, because of the limited size and infrastructure. As long as Panama becomes clear with a set of laws that are imposed, because it's harder to open a bank account here than in the United States, and as I said, put it to a higher level, take this matter seriously, as we took the Panama Canal issue seriously, and that we're not laundering money, that there are very strict banking regulations that does not allow for, even if there is the instrument here, which is the corporate having bearer shares. If you go to a bank with a company having bearer shares, the local bank or international bank, especially the local ones with the Panamanian capital, will not allow you to open a bank account if the corporation has bearer shares. So, if we come through with all these issues and making them very clear that Panama respects and enforces the law that we already have. We're not discovering the fire here. We could come out with a positive response.
One observation and one response. The observation is Panama's territorial tax system is the right approach. The reason, though, that there's conflict with other nations is they have the worldwide tax system, and they want the right to tax things that do occur inside Panama. So that's why the fight exists. It doesn't matter how good and how well enforced your territorial tax system is, so long as other countries want to reach into Panama and tax things that happen in Panama, then the fight necessarily exists. If I, as an American, even if I lived here in Panama, and I did business only in Panama, the United States government, the IRS, would still want to know and tax all that information. So worldwide taxation, by definition, is in conflict with territorial tax systems. But now let me give you the response. I agree and disagree. I sound like a politician, but let me explain. I disagree in the sense that I don't think the United Nations or the OAS will be productive. The United Nations actually has something called the Committee of Experts on International Tax Matters, and if you look at the stuff they produce, it could have been at the OECD in Paris or the European Commission in Brussels. In other words, they're, I think, too far to the left and too far gone. Where I think Panama might have some success, although, you know, I don't trust that it's a guaranteed success, is the World Trade Organization. Because a lot of what the US is trying to do, a lot of what the OECD is trying to do, is based on financial protectionism that in theory, if you're a WTO signatory, you should not be allowed to do. As a matter of fact, if you just read the law, I'm told by trade lawyers, I'm a tax economist, not a trade lawyer, but just listening to trade lawyers who have analyzed this and written about it, they say it should be a slam dunk that the high tax nations who try to impose protectionism would lose their case, and therefore they then have to compensate you somehow. But here's the problem, because I think that Panama and other countries should pursue that angle, but here's the one thing that worries me. The WTO is an international bureaucracy. Who pays most of their salaries? The bigger countries. If the bigger countries basically sort of pull the senior WTO people into a room and say, you will decide this case this way regardless of the law, then, in other words, I don't think there's a guarantee at the end of the day that you would win, because I think that somebody might put their thumb on the scale, or thumbs, there'd be several thumbs. But I think that the law is on your side, and I think if you're going to go above and beyond bilateral, if you're going to go to an international forum to try to resolve this in your favor, the WTO is probably your best bet. Yes, sir.
Switching gears earlier, we've been talking about direct taxes, but there's indirect taxes such as for inflation. So we use the dollar, and the United States prints dollars, and the way to get through there is the problem that we're seeing. Can you just talk a little bit about how that impacts us here in Panama and the unseen inflation tax?
Well, that's a bit of a mystery, because we've clearly had a lot of quantitative easing. We've had a lot of easy money, but it hasn't really broken out into the consumer price index yet. Now, we're seeing some of it, like with food prices and things like that shooting up. There's a couple of things that are out there. When you're looking at quantitative easing, it's not just the supply of money, you also want to look at the demand for money. But then, even more specifically, one of the reasons why I think that this easy money hasn't really spilled out into the overall economy yet is because banks are neutralizing it. Banks in the United States have, I think it's $1.75 trillion of excess reserves parked at the Fed. So in other words, the Fed is trying to pour money into the economy, which, by the way, I don't think is a good solution. The problems we have in the United States are not because we don't have enough liquidity. There's tons of liquidity sloshing around in the global economy now. The problems we have are structural: bad government tax policy, bad regulations, things like that. But nonetheless, the Fed, like good Keynesians they are, has pushed all this money into the economy. Well, what's happening? They push it onto the banks then turn around and they just deposit it at the Fed. Why are they depositing it at the Fed? Well, because they get, 1/8% interest on it? And they don't really think they can make any money by lending it to the private sector, which in some sense is a pretty damning indictment of Obamonomics. But that's also good news, because they, in effect, are sterilizing the easy money policy of the Fed. So at least we're being protected from not only stagnation, but then also inflation. Remember, we had stagflation in the 1970s in the US? Well, we're not having that now. We're just having the stagnation part. Well, if that money actually went out of the banks into the overall economy, we might have the stagflation. And then, of course, since you use the dollar, you guys would sort of suffer. The old joke used to be that if the U.S. Sneezes, Canada catches a cold. Well, if we do something really stupid with the dollar, Panama suffers. But the good news is the banks are sort of stopping the Fed's misguided policy. It's probably not a very satisfactory answer, but I think it's at least the best I can offer right now. Yes, sir.
Can I take you on what you just said and ask you, what do you think about secular stagnation?
Secular stagnation? Well, if you follow U.S. economic policy debates, you'll have seen this phrase secular stagnation, which is simply what the Keynesians are saying is, by the way, what's Keynesian economics? It's the notion that you take money out of your right pocket, put it in your left pocket, and you're richer. Keynesian economics didn't work for Hoover and Roosevelt in the 30s, didn't work for Japan in the 90s, didn't work for Bush in 2008, didn't work for Obama in 2009, but that's separate. The Keynesians believe that what they're trying to tell us is that, well, the reason that our policies didn't work is because we didn't borrow and spend enough money because we have something called secular stagnation, and therefore we just have to up the ante. We have to do more government spending. I obviously disagree. Because not only do I think our problems are unrelated to liquidity, I think our problems are not just unrelated to government spending, I think they're in part caused by government spending. A lot of the weakness in our employment markets is because government has passed all these redistribution policies that make it more attractive not to work than to work for some people. So if you're paying someone to sit on their rear end all day instead of going out into the labor market and getting a job, guess what? Your economic output is going to fall. So I think that when people like Larry Summers talk about secular stagnation, I think they're just using a buzz phrase to try to justify more government intervention, more borrowing and spending in the economy, and it's not the answer. The answer is to restrain the growth of spending so that government grows slower than the private sector. Matter of fact, if I was to give you one fiscal policy rule, general fiscal policy rule, nothing to do with the international tax fight, but the one general fiscal policy rule that you should apply to your own government is make sure that government spending in the long run grows by less than the private economy grows. If you do it the other way around, if government grows faster than the private economy, it's just a matter of time before you become Greece. If the private economy grows faster than government, though, it's just a matter of time before you become Hong Kong. So don't focus so much on deficits and debt, because that sort of gets you mixed up with the business cycle and things like that. Focus on the long-run growth of government spending, and probably the best model to follow is Switzerland, because they adopted something called the debt brake back in 2002, but it's not really a debt brake, it's a spending cap. But because they address the underlying disease of government spending, that automatically solves the symptom of too much borrowing and debt. There and then there.
We were looking into the idea of strengthening the confidentiality laws here. Because what happened with all these tax policies that they are unilateral, they try to make them automatic. And this is a big problem because people doesn't have, the way they're going are going towards an automatic exchange of information. But if you look at what the US does, they don't do that. They would say, no, people have rights, and we can go and take this information from so-and-so. We can give you some information, but we cannot give you all the information. Would it be worth it for us to strengthen our confidentiality laws? Not only because of this, just because the government has become a large intruder into our information and into our data. Would this be a way of stopping at least the discretionality of the government of giving away tax information to third parties?
Well, in theory, the best way of addressing that is by putting in place due process legal protections. Well, we're not going to exchange information unless the other government has a human rights record that makes them trustworthy. We're not going to exchange information unless another government has data protection so that the hackers and identity thieves can't get a hold of the information. I mean, there's all sorts of things that you can do in terms of requiring a finding by a court of probable cause of doing something wrong. The problem is that the whole OECD, if you look at their standard for automatic exchange of financial tax information, I think they call it, that assumes, especially when you marry that to their Convention on Mutual Administrative Assistance in Tax Matters, what they genuinely want is automatic data dumps. They don't even want fishing expeditions. They want the fish to jump in the boat. And if you have these automatic data dumps between countries, and you look at some of the countries that have signed on to this OECD convention, they're countries that have terrible human rights records. There are countries that you know that they don't have ability to protect data from outside hackers. Now, this probably gets more into something where you should ask a lawyer rather than a public finance economist. So I'm very sympathetic to what you're implying by your question, and I know that it's a real problem, but in terms of the specific things that Panama should insist on, above and beyond, of course, the reciprocity argument that I made, that probably gets somewhat outside my area of expertise.
I know you're not a lawyer, but this is just, yes, I want to know your feeling about it. Do you think it will be possible? I mean, do you think FATCA will go to a Supreme Court decision soon, and if so, what do you think will be? I mean, it's difficult to guess, but
FATCA is being legally challenged. I frankly have more hope about what will happen as a result of Congress changing the Senate changing hands. I think that probably gives more opportunities, because a legal fight, first of all, it's going to take years by the time it goes up to different appeals courts and things like that. And then ultimately, with the Supreme Court in the United States, it really comes down to a political decision. Now, we saw with Obamacare that John Roberts changed his view after the decision was already made, because he just decided that politically he didn't want to withstand the pressure of having knocked down Obamacare, even though it's inconsistent with the U.S. Constitution. So I hope the legal challenge succeeds, but I personally have more faith in legislative changes of the kind that Senator Rand Paul is pushing.
Probably will be quicker. No.
And it would be quicker. Other questions? Well, Carlos, are you going to be